At 4 a.m. on November 7, 1811, Indian forces of Tecumseh's Confederacy silently crept towards an American camp under command of William Henry Harrison, governor of the Indiana Territory. Harrison and his army had moved towards Prophetstown, the capital of Tecumseh's Confederacy, with the aim of forcing Tenskwatawa, Tecumseh's brother and interim leader, to give in to his demands. Harrison's 1,000-man army slept with loaded guns and roaring fires, as they expected a fight from Tenskwatawa's warriors. Tenskwatawa, a spiritual leader of the Confederacy, desperately wanted to defend his capital city of Prophetstown. In 1809, governor of the Indiana Territory, William Henry Harrison, signed the Treaty of Fort Wayne with the Miami, Potawatomi, and Lenape tribes. In this treaty, the signatory tribes sold nearly 3 million acres of land to the United States for just 2 cents per acre. However, Tecumseh, the leader of the Shawnee, strongly disagreed with this treaty. Tecumseh believed that the land was owned in common by all tribes and could not be sold without complete agreement from every tribe. Although Tecumseh resisted the Treaty of Fort Wayne, he could not actively resist the US military, so instead he urged other warriors to abandon their chiefs and join his confederacy, which he based out of the Indian city of Prophetstown. In 1810, Tecumseh met with Governor Harrison at his home. Tecumseh demanded the nullification of the Treaty of Fort Wayne and the return of the sold lands to the Indians. Harrison stated that other tribes had made a fair agreement with the United States and ridiculed the idea of common ownership of the land. Tecumseh told Harrison that if the lands were not returned, he would make an alliance with the British. In the following year, Harrison blamed the Shawnee for murders of settlers on the frontier. Harrison hoped to use these murders as a justification to attack the Shawnee, as in a letter he wrote, "In Indian warfare, there is no security but in offensive measures." Harrison summoned Tecumseh to another meeting at his home, but the meeting proved unproductive as Tecumseh still did not give in on his requests. During this meeting, Tecumseh told Harrison that he was headed south to recruit from the Muskogee and Choctaw tribes for his confederacy. Tecumseh requested for Harrison and his brother Tenskwatawa to wait until he returned to commence the settlement of the disputed lands. Tenskwatawa lived in Prophetstown, the heart of Tecumseh's newly formed confederacy. By this point, Prophetstown had a population of nearly 6,000 people, making it larger in population than any American city in the region. More importantly, the city had between 500 and 700 warriors, strengthening the city even more. The population of Prophetstown was dispersed from many other Indian tribes, including Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Winnebago, Shawnee, and Wyandot. William Henry Harrison believed that the Indians could only be dealt with forcefully. However, the U.S. Secretary of War, William Eustis, ordered Harrison to preserve peace with the Indians. However, if the Indians did threaten America, they were to be dealt with militarily. Harrison then issued a series of demands to Tenskwatawa. Tenskwatawa only obliged to some of Harrison's demands, so Harrison began raising troops. Harrison's force consisted of 400 Army regulars, 500 Indiana militiamen, and 120 Kentucky militiamen. 200 of these men were mounted, and Harrison's force numbered around 1,000 men. Harrison gathered his men at Fort Knox in Indiana and marched to Terre Haute, Indiana, where he encamped his forces and constructed Fort Harrison as a staging point for his campaign. When an American guard was shot outside Fort Harrison, Governor Harrison decided that there was no other option but to attack Tecumseh's Confederacy. Harrison marched his forces towards Prophetstown and reached the outskirts on November 6. Harrison then encamped his army near Burnett's Creek, Harrison was to meet with Tenskwatawa the next day, but he was not optimistic about the negotiations. Remembering the Battle of the Wabash, Harrison ordered his troops to sleep fully dressed and armed, and to keep fires blazing to illuminate the camp in case of an attack. The perimeter of the American camp was guarded by 2 sentries. The Indians at Prophetstown were aware of the position of the American army. However, Prophetstown was not completely fortified. Because of this, at a war council meeting on the night of November 6, Tenskwatawa ordered a preemptive attack on the American army, specifically by sending a small stealth squad to kill Governor William Henry Harrison in his tent. Tenskwatawa, largely a spiritual leader of the Confederacy, promised to cast spells that would ensure his warriors would not be harmed. At around 4 a.m., the Indians initiated their assault. The right wing, made up of Kickapoos, was led by Chief Mengoatawa. The left wing was made up of Winnebagos, led by Chief Waweapakusa. And the center was made up of Potawatomis, led by Roundhead and Wabaunsi. Tenskwatawa did not fight in the battle. Instead, he chanted and cast spells to protect his men from injury during the battle. The Kickapoos reached the American camp before the other 2 groups. At around 4:30 a.m., they encountered an American sentry who managed to get a shot off before he was slain. This gunshot awoke many American soldiers who were already prepared for battle. The Indians reached the northwest corner of the camp by around 5:30 a.m., and at that same time, Harrison awoke from his tent. By this time, the Americans were made well aware of the Indian presence, which meant that the initial Indian plan of sneaking in the camp to assassinate Harrison was out the window. As the Indian forces massed, they broke the line of American forces under Captain Robert Barton and Frederick Geiger. Harrison noticed this looming threat to the American position and reinforced the area with Indiana militia. On the American line facing Prophetstown, Harrison saw a fierce battle ensuing in a grove of trees. The Americans took heavy fire, but with additional reinforcements, they were able to hold their line. On the northern end of the battle, Major Davis led his dragoons on a countercharge against the Indian forces. However, in the fierce skirmish that ensued, Major Davis was killed, and his force then retreated to Harrison's main line. On the line facing Prophetstown, American forces beat back Indian warriors and cleared the grove in which they previously fought. On the southern end of the camp, the Indiana Yellow Jackets came under heavy fire from the Winnebagos and were unable to hold their line. The commander of the Yellow Jackets, Captain Spear Spencer, was shot twice in the leg and once in the head, but continued to encourage his men to fight on. When he was lifted up by some of his men, he was shot in the torso and instantly died. Harrison moved 2 reserve companies to assist the now disheveled Yellow Jackets and finally filled the breach in the line. Several more skirmishes were fought around the camp until 7 a.m. The remaining Indian forces realized they were outnumbered by 2 to 1 and withdrew from the battle. American forces sustained 188 casualties with 62 killed and 126 wounded. Tenskwatawa's forces sustained an estimated 50 killed and 75 wounded. The Indians retreated to Prophetstown and confronted Tenskwatawa, accusing him of being a fraud for letting their warriors die. Tenskwatawa urged his men to form a second attack. However, they refused. The entire population of Prophetstown abandoned the city that night. The next day, Harrison sent a small force to Prophetstown, who discovered it completely abandoned. Harrison ordered the city to be completely burnt to the ground. Harrison's victory at the Battle of Tippecanoe proved a crippling point for Tecumseh's Confederacy, as it never fully recovered after the fall of Prophetstown, although many future attempts would be made. Tenskwatawa's influence in Tecumseh's Confederacy plummeted after the battle, and he was no longer seen as a religious leader. Tecumseh continued his fight against the Americans by allying with Britain in the War of 1812, and his movement continued to threaten the United States until his death at the Battle of the Thames.